Now, last year, Gerrard, an eminent doctor and businessman suffering from dementia, went into a marked decline after a 5-week stay in hospital where he was being treated for a physical ailment. His daughter, the best-selling novelist Nicci Gerrard, thinks that this decline could have been avoided if family members had been able to stay with her father in hospital, as parents are able to do with sick children. Now, Nicci has mobilised a wide range of people to bring about a change of culture in hospitals and has created John's campaign to highlight the issues involved. Welcome, Nicci. Now, this is a campaign for a change in culture, not a change in the law. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's a campaign for changing culture, which would have to involve hospitals, politicians, and the public in general.
Yes, now I know it's relatively recently and so forth, but just tell us a little bit about your father before he went into hospital.
OK, he'd had Alzheimer's for about 10 years before he went into hospital, but it was inexorable, of course, but it was a slow decline, and he could have a good life. He lived at home with my mother, who was his wife of 61 years. He could walk, he could talk, he could tell stories about his past, which was very vivid to him. He could work in the garden.
And, of course, we put old people into a category, but before he had become an old person, he'd been a very, very capable man, a very adroit man.
He was clever, he was immensely competent. He'd cared for my mother for many years, who was an invalid. A lot of his identity came from caring for other people. He was very courteous, he was very stoical. He was a good man.
Yes. And then come along just some ulcers, nothing terribly serious, and he goes into hospital for just 5 weeks, not that long, and what happens?
Well, it shouldn't even have been 5 weeks. I mean, people with dementia often stay in hospital much longer than they should do anyway. The ulcers were slow to heal, there was norovirus in the hospital, there was no rehab bed was available. So he came out after 5 weeks. He went in kind of mobile, articulate, able to look after him. He came out, he was skeletal, he couldn't walk, he couldn't put one leg in front of another, he couldn't talk, he couldn't even say a word, let alone a sentence. He was incontinent, he couldn't feed himself, he couldn't sit up in bed. He was not really in this life anymore. We took him back home, thinking that maybe we could draw him back through kind of love and attention. We had a 24-hour carer, but we couldn't. So in November, he died. He died never having really returned to the life he'd had before. And we are very certain that, I mean, my father had Alzheimer's. He was 86. I do not know when he would have died or what his outcome would have been, but we are very sure that those 5 weeks in hospital were catastrophic for him. So he went off a cliff, really.
And this is your story, but we're talking about it because it happens to a lot of people. They go into hospital for something relatively minor, they get stuck there, and then there is a terrible decline. And the question is, why do you think that happens?
Well, and actually, having written about it in The Observer, there's been an outpouring of support and stories from other people who've gone through almost exactly the same thing themselves. And crucially, I'm really not saying that it was the doctor's fault. They cured his leg ulcers, they did what they were meant to. It was not the nurse's fault. The nurses were off. They were so overstretched. My father needed one-to-one attention, as did almost everybody else in that ward, which was a general medical ward, had dementia. 1 in 4 beds are occupied by people with dementia. So if we'd been able to feed him, to give him drink, to help him walk, to hold his hand, to read him poetry, to talk to him.
So here is a proposal for improving things in the NHS which does not need a vast multi-billion-pound injection of funds. It just needs hospitals to allow in families to sit with loved ones who are older, just as they do with children.
It's a completely simple and very achievable campaign. It's about kind of human decency and kindness. It's got this beautiful simplicity about it. And we're not saying it's a duty. Lots of carers need respite when people with dementia go into hospital. But it should be a right for every single person with dementia to have a carer there, just to keep them safe and anchored. And actually, you know, the costs, if any, would be tiny and the benefits would be enormous.
Now, you've got Labour and Liberal Democrat support, I think. I guess the hospitals would say the problem is lots more people coming into the wards. They're crowded already. They'll spill coffee. They'll bring in bugs. They'll want things. It makes things more complicated and crowded in a difficult situation already.
Well, you say that. I don't think that hospitals would say that anymore because they're at breaking point. And if you go into a hospital and you see how many people with dementia are there, and you see the kind of terrible distress of it, and you see how nurses cannot cope with the demand that's being put on them, I think that hospitals and the nursing staff would welcome it because actually the benefits so override the small hiccups of change.
So this is John's campaign. What more support do you need to get this cultural change, do you think?
Well, we need support from all different sides. I mean, I think we have overwhelming public support. I do not think that anybody who heard the idea would be able to disagree with it. We need support from hospitals, and each hospital needs to find their own way of implementing it, but they have to accept it as a principle. And of course we need political support.
It's a nice, simple idea. I wish we had some politicians in the studio to talk about it. Oh, we do. Ha! Prime Minister, welcome. Now, we might ask you about that.
Ahead with trying to solve some of the problems in healthcare in our country, like what Nicci was talking about in terms of dementia. Let's make ourselves a more dementia-friendly.
Idea, by the way, of letting families into hospitals.
I think there's a lot of merit in it. I think all the things we can do to try and help those suffering with dementia to keep hold of memories, to try and keep hold of family. Because we've doubled the money into dementia research, but it's not just the money that counts. It's making ourselves a more dementia-friendly country. I did something which I don't think any Prime Minister's done before. We had the whole Cabinet trained as dementia friends at a Cabinet meeting just a few weeks ago, because what we need is our whole society to be more friendly to people.
As I decline, Jeremy Hunt will be knocking on my door. It's a slightly scary thought with respect to him.